Welcome to the Well Dwellers podcast. I am so thankful you are here today with me. My name is Eric Freiberger, and I'm coming to you from Treaty 7 lands here in Calgary, Alberta. I'm the creator and host here at the Well Dwellers podcast. Today, I am excited to sit here with Angela Reitsma Bick in conversation. She is a writer, editor, speaker, and the author of the book, Blessed Are the Undone. Angela's work has continually resonated with people who find themselves wrestling with faith, grief, uncertainty, and what it means to encounter God when life no longer holds together in the ways we necessarily expected. Her writing is deeply honest, contemplative, and grounded in the belief that spirituality is not about pretending we are whole, certain, or triumphant, but about learning to recognize the sacred within our unraveling journeys in life and identity. As I spent time with Angela's work and as I spent time with her a little over a year ago, I kept returning to something that felt deeply familiar with me personally, especially through the lens of disability, advocacy, and belonging. So much of modern spirituality, and honestly so much of church culture, is built around strength, certainty, productivity, and the appearance of having everything together. But Angela's work seems to point us somewhere else. She reminds us that God often meets us not in our coherence or success, but in vulnerability, disorientation, grief, dependence, and undoneness, something we will definitely dive into. And for many disabled people, including myself, this experience of being undone is not simply metaphorical theology. It is a lived reality. It is navigating systems and spaces that were not built with us in mind. It is carrying both exclusion and belonging at the same time. It is learning to survive, adapt, grieve, resist, and still imagine hope. Not as a chosen spiritual practice, but as the reality of inhabiting the world we live in. That's part of why I felt this conversation was so important for us to have. In this episode, I am hoping to explore with Angela how her theology of unraveling resonates deeply with disabled spirituality, with the church as a space of both harm and healing, with disability advocacy and justice movements, and with the ongoing relationship between Indigenous First Nations communities and reconciliation here in Canada. We also will hopefully talk about a prophetic imagination and why hope is needed for reimagining broken systems. Perhaps most importantly, out of all of these, I'd like this conversation to invite us to consider that perhaps becoming undone is not failure, something I wrestle with myself from time to time. Perhaps it is where deeper forms of community, compassion, and transformation can begin. So wherever you are listening from today, whether you feel certain, exhausted, hopeful, grieving, or somewhere in the in-between, I hope this conversation gives you permission to breathe a little deeper into those places within yourself that are still becoming and desiring for more of an amazing adventure into discovering God in the midst of our being. It has been far too long, but welcome to the Well Dwellers podcast, Angela. I am really excited to have you here with me today.
Thank you. And thank you for that lovely and thoughtful introduction.
No, this is good. You know, I thought we would start with some fun questions. And I got to tell you, this is probably one of the most exciting intro fun questions I get to ask because it's right in line with some of my fun activities too. The book obviously shows that you have a deep passion for nature and getting into the outdoors, taking those backcountry adventures. What is one of the best outdoor adventures you've experienced and why?
Well, both the best and the hardest probably camping trip, it would be the same thing. I went tree planting in my early 20s, which is kind of a rite of passage in my family. Both my parents tree planted, almost all my aunts and uncles on one side of the family. And I lived in a planting camp when I was 3 or 4 with my sisters, and my parents were both planting, and we stayed in the cook shack. So this was pretty remote, pretty wild. When I was in my 20s and did that, you're living in a tent for the whole summer. You plant in the daytime, you eat in a cook shack, you shower in an old canvas tent kind of rigged up with running water. And when you sort of felt like if you could survive this, you could survive anything. It's very demanding physically, but then it's so satisfying on the best days. You hit those high numbers, you can plant 3,000 trees in one day and there's this little tiny forest and you're like, hey, I did that. And that part's very satisfying.
That's cool. Do you ever go back to that area and see some of those trees?
Yeah, we did actually. My husband and I drove up. There was one spot, it was about 3 hours north of Thunder Bay. And on our
Mm.
honeymoon, my husband also planted. And so on our honeymoon, we drove to Thunder Bay, went north, found the right logging trail, and found those trees. And it was 3 years later, and they were already 6 or 7 feet high. It was so cool to see how well they were doing. Black spruce grows really fast. So that's why
Wow.
it's planted. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this is a bit of a curiosity. I thought you might talk about a canoe trip because you talk about canoeing in the book. Is there a particular river that's the best to canoe on?
Eric, I have to tell you, I've never gone canoe camping. This is a real-time
Oh,
confession. Peter's family has done that a lot. Our family has done day trips, and we car camp a lot. But our first backcountry canoe camping is actually going to be this August. So I can tell you more about it after that.
okay. Okay. Well, that sounds exciting. I'm fearful to tell you about my greatest adventure.
Well, I'd love to hear it.
One of my most memories. Well, I don't want to get you scared now for going on that canoe trip. When I was younger, before I was in a wheelchair, I went with a whole group of scouts and we went on a 5-day canoe trip down the Red Deer River.
Mhm.
And it rained for 3.5, 4 days.
Oh, that's miserable.
Yeah, it was still one of the most memorable experiences of my life. I remember by the third day, we were so exhausted, we would just cruise down the river and we drifted into Drumheller.
Wow.
And all of us scouts, we revolted against the leaders, said, we're not doing campfire eating this time. We are going in town and having pizza. And so
They need more sustenance. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure the restaurant was not pleased to see a whole bunch of teenagers coming in with no showers after 3 days in the river, but it was pretty amazing. So during these trips, uh, speaking of food, maybe I'll ask you, what's one food that maybe you crave the most while you're in those backwoods there?
Probably when I was tree planting, it would have to be homemade cookies, chocolate chip cookies. Yeah, baked goods, those kinds of things, the luxuries.
Mm, yes, true. Yes. Now we have Ziplocs. We just tuck them away. Yeah, that's awesome. Well, maybe we'll get started with talking a bit of this blessed or the undone and this understanding of undoneness. Angela, in your book, Blessed Are the Undone, you write about holy disruption and sacred unraveling. What first led you to this language of undoneness as a spiritual category? And I think about it in the context of I've heard lots about the nuns and duns, but you come up with this undoneness language. I'm just curious where that comes from.
Yeah, the idea of undone, that was a phrase Peter coined, my co-author, when we were trying to brainstorm different titles and kind of overarching metaphors for the book. I like your phrase, the theology of unraveling. I think this idea of measuring religiosity or religiosity, it's this kind of famously difficult task, right? So the Canadian census, like if you think about how they ask that question, whether or not people consider themselves religious. So lots of questions focus on denomination or on spiritual habits. Do you go to church? The category of nuns and duns started to come up when more and more people checked the box nun when they were asked about religious affiliation. And then the duns was added in, people maybe who'd grown up going to church, but now they were done with it, that idea.
Mm.
I once looked at a copy of the census from 1901 and tried to count the list of denominations. There were over 100. That was 120 years ago when most Canadians would have said they were Christian. So then the question got more specific. It was broken down by denomination. Now the census, 2026 census, had about 200 options still under religious affiliation, but half were denominations, half are now other religions. And then at the very bottom, there's this category of no religion. So in 2020, we're down to about 10% of Canadians who self-identify as Christian. And as I said, the main measuring stick is just church attendance. But I think we need better ways to measure the faith of people who don't fit in the box of church attendance, right? Especially since that group has grown so much bigger. I think what Peter and I were struggling with as we were doing our research was just that we need more ways of understanding belief and behavior and belonging. We need a bigger language to talk about what kind of Christian people are and how they identify as. So we're trying to add to the, lexicon by coining this word undone. And the shortest definition of deconstruction is just faith undone. And it conveys that disillusion that somebody might have with the church or disappointment. You've lost ties with your faith community. You've lost something, but it's not necessarily the end of the story. That's the short version of our undone, what we mean by.
Yeah. I think I really resonated and liked that because I always struggled with the idea of nuns and duns because I sort of think to myself, I don't think anyone really fits a nun's category. Yeah. And duns is so, how do I put it?
Final?
Like final. That's the word I'm looking for. Yeah. So final. And that is just doesn't fit life, especially when you're spiritual beings. And I know, no matter how you look at it, humanity finds some sort of spiritual expression and it is never done. There's always a journey that we're on and we're never alone in that journey either. So the idea of undoneness is so perfect and fits so well because we don't know when that undoneness and how it's going to become something more. So that's cool.
That's so true.
Yeah. Do you see undoneness as a form of grace rather than failure?
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's evident right away in the title. We deliberately paired undone, which might have negative connotations, maybe not, but we paired it with this positive, more hopeful word, right? Blessed. Because even though the process of being undone, it's painful, it is still a chance to experience that some measure of blessing. And here we kind of need to do an asterisk and say, it's not hashtag blessed. It's not prosperity gospel blessing, but it's the kind of blessing Jesus offers in the Sermon on the Mount. And it's this blessing through which we can experience grace and humility and through which we can extend compassion to others.
Yeah.
So I definitely see grace in there. There's it doesn't include failure because in our framing of it, deconstruction is normative. So then it's actually needed, right? As a corrective to what has been malformed, either in the church or in our personal faith. So speaking of things that are malformed, some of our models of church, the attractional model or the prosperity gospel we mentioned, the success-based model, whatever version places this high value on growth or numbers or fame, all of those things need to be deconstructed, I think. So then becoming undone might simply be faithfulness or showing up. It might look different than we expect, but it might be a call back to the gospel origins, I think.
Hmm. I hope it's okay I do this. I'm going to take us down a little bit of a rabbit trail thought. When you were sharing there and you used the word deconstruction, which I know many people get a little fearful of. Oh, no, it's that word, that D word, deconstruction.
Mhm.
Why do you think so many people within church are maybe nervous or uncomfortable with this word deconstruction? And how can we reframe it for them to maybe be a little more comfortable and recognize that all of us go through this process?
Yeah, I think inside of deconstruction, you can find the same letters that make up the word destruction, and that freaks people out.
Mm.
Anything that kind of smacks of failure, like you said already, we don't like because we don't want to fail at anything, right? We don't want our churches to fail. We don't want to look like we're failing. We don't want the bad publicity, frankly, that it might seem is part of it. So here's another way of answering that question. I was the editor of a faith-based publication for a long time. It wasn't affiliated with a denomination, but a colleague of mine who was the editor of the Anglican Journal, there was one meeting of the Anglican Church one summer, and the publication was up on the chopping block. People wanted to get rid of it. It cost too much money. No one was reading. Why do we need this paper? And one of the reasons why they debated whether or not to keep the Anglican Journal was the question came to the editor, can't you stop investigating us? Just print good stories about the Anglican Church. Why are you digging dirt on us? Why are you finding these critical stories, right? I think it's a little bit of the same sense. I hear that same fear behind people who are worried about deconstruction. They don't want the negative press behind reasons why people might be deconstructing. But it doesn't have to be either or, right? It's not only the good stories or things that need light shed on them that are genuine problems. Like, we need both. If all we did was publish positive puff piece stories, that's just marketing. That's not the truth. And so I think the stories of people deconstructing need to be heard and talked about. And they're not something to be scared of. They're part of the sanctification of the church, in my opinion.
Yeah. And I even think of the model of Jesus and, how he speaks of, I'm paraphrasing a bit, but as how he speaks, lets a seed fall to the ground and die, essentially.
Yeah.
New growth, development, flourishing of the gospel can't happen. So we need to allow for that process. And I think one of the beauties of that message and that incarnational and fleshing that Jesus shows us is it doesn't have to be outside the church.
Right.
Deconstruction and the reconstruction, if you will, using Richard Rohr's language.
Yeah.
It can happen while you are in church community.
Sure.
And you can even argue that it needs community supports for that discipling, natural growth, spiritual growth to happen, to take place.
Yeah, I fully agree. Yeah, you nailed it.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you, is undoneness a kind of spiritual exile? I think that, tied to what I was just sharing, I think that's one of the other things is worried that if I go into a deconstruction phase, that I'm going to be exiled by the church, or I'm exiling myself. If so, can exile, even if we do find ourselves out in the liminality spaces, become a site of kind of divine encounter? Jesus in the desert, I think of, perhaps even calling.
Yeah, for sure. And there's so many examples of that in scripture, right? There's Jacob. He wrestles with God. He's blessed, but walks with a limp. Isaiah uses the word undone. He says, woe is me, I am undone. But then he's blessed by an angel, and then he's given this task of becoming a prophet. So his job is kind of twofold. He's telling the Israelites, they're in exile, how to rebuild, right? So he's almost giving them that reconstruction advice, like you said. And the way that he says they will rebuild in the ruins is by taking better care of each other. So he offers them that same blessing, a type of attention to the needs of the people around you, and that's fueling the social change. So that blessing, it's turning people toward each other, even in that space of exile.
Yeah. Yeah. I think as we were speaking before, we were talking a bit about Joash Thomas.
Uh-huh.
And I was kind of reviewing some notes and some writing, and I remember him also speaking in his book about the Jeremiah passage where God is speaking to the Israelites, saying in their exile, go build homes, plant gardens, and
Yeah.
seek the welfare of the city. That's, I think, one of the other narrative stories we can tell ourselves going into a process of deconstruction. Even as a community, we can tell that story of let's build homes in this state of exile. Here in Alberta, especially, I think the disabled community is experiencing a lot of that sense of the deconstruction process, if you will. I think there's some struggling going on. I think there's even the question of, is spirituality important for us as a disabled community, particularly here in Alberta, when we feel so marginalized and pushed out into the boundaries? It's this desire to belong, and yet struggling, as I said in the introduction, with the sense of exclusion. We want to see that belonging, but we recognize we're in a place of exclusion. So living in a constant state of being undone, you might say liminality, as I had used earlier, physically, socially, economically, and spiritually. How does the theology you're sharing in Blessed are the Undone speak into the disabled experience without romanticizing the suffering?
Yeah, the most helpful distinction that I've found here is between a theology of suffering and a theology of the sufferer. So the first one, the theology of suffering, it tries to explain the suffering. And it's kind of merciless, and it's hunting down and trying to find the reason and making sense of the pain. And maybe it can't be made sense of in our fallen world that we live in. I think Job's friends have this theology of suffering. They are well-intentioned, but they're misguided and ultimately very unhelpful. All their theories, they do no good. If you hear somebody say everything happens for a reason or God won't give you more than you can handle, those are other modern examples of this unhelpful theology. But I think a theology of the sufferer is more comforting and closer to the way Christ acted. So here you kind of give up on the search for meaning and you focus on the closeness of God to the person who is suffering. So Christ came to earth, he suffered. With this lens, we can just sort of remind ourselves that God understands. He sees us in our suffering. He is with us. I think that gives a better opportunity for lament or anger. Those are appropriate. And even if you're arguing or lamenting, that like all of that still, you're beginning with the assumption that there is a God who's listening and cares about us. And to me, that's a more hopeful spot to start.
Yeah. Perhaps that's a good place to ask, where do you see the church confusing healing with erasure when it comes to disability? I know in the book, you talk a bit about some of the faith healing experiences and some of the people you interviewed. How can some of those stories, and I know, I could see how they mirrored into some of the disabled life experiences. How can the church recognize how those kind of narratives become almost an erasure to those who are struggling with disability or poor health or chronic illness?
Yeah, I think, are you remembering the story of Jessica, she apprehended a home invader and her leg was cut quite badly? Is that the story you're thinking of?
I know I thought I remember a few stories in there, but
Yeah.
go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, she had a nerve severed and almost died, and was quite uh, um, affected by subsequent surgeries and unable to work, and just like very traumatized and physically altered by that encounter. And her church community at the time said things like, "Well, the shepherd sometimes breaks the sheep's legs to, increase their trust in him." Things like that. They're just similar to that. What you hear kind of Job's friends, like they're trying to make sense of it. They didn't know they didn't know what to say, but then they said unhelpful things. So they were ended up, her and her husband, moving to an Anglican community about a year after this attack. And in there she found just this deeper and richer understanding of what had happened to her, and was able to kind of make sense of it and say, God didn't want this to happen to you. This was not God's will for your life. And then later was able to go to court and interact with the person who had invaded their home and attacked them, and offer forgiveness. And I'm not explaining this very well, but I think maybe that's what you're getting at.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think one of the things I'm also thinking from those stories is there a sense of how undone perhaps becomes dangerous when it is imposed on a person rather than chosen. Because as I shared, I think we can go through those chosen deconstructions when we're within a church community and find support. But what are the dangers that maybe are not being seen by the church when that undoneness is imposed on a person like Jessica?
Yeah, we sort of distinguish in the book between external factors and internal factors that might begin a deconstruction process. So sometimes they can just be these internal, you're wrestling with something mentally, there's cognitive dissonance, there's a theology that you're trying to understand or fit with something different that you learned or different that happened. Those can all be kind of invisible and internal. The external factors are, like you mentioned, it can be something that a person did not choose, something that happens to them. So, like the traumatic event of Jessica, or another example would be a child or anybody really experiencing abuse at the hands of a clergy or somebody in a church community. So, in the book, we had a couple of different visual categories for these. We didn't develop the illusion too far, but the guy on the front cover who's portaging to a new church community, we had other versions of him. So there's a person in a canoe that our designer made, and he's just floating. So he's kind of lost. He has no paddle. He's adrift. So that could be some of the internal struggles. There's another version where the canoe kind of hits a rock and the little guy's just like stuck there. And that can be maybe again trying to make sense of something tricky, or the texts of violence were one issue that different people mentioned as something that they really can't understand. And then those external factors we illustrated by somebody in their canoe, and they actually are capsized, so they're fully, like, they're upside down. That's more it can be the most devastating type of deconstruction, I think, when that kind of thing happens to you. And then what?
I was sort of thinking in the midst of that, one of the questions I was going to ask you was, can the church learn to see disabled bodies as theological teachers rather than ministry projects? But before, I like to hear your thoughts there, but when you were describing kind of the different ways in which that deconstruction is experienced and that undoneness, what I began to envision and ponder is that the church for years, for maybe even centuries, has subconsciously created a discipling pattern of kind of a cerebral, mental discipleship.
Yeah.
It's all, if I can, this may be the wrong wording, but it's all theory. It's all books and knowledge and head use.
Yeah.
Getting it to the heart, getting it to the enfleshing, when very articulately in the Gospel John says, the Word became flesh.
Yeah.
Jesus embodied it. And I'm wondering how maybe the church has somehow fallen asleep to that idea that it's not just about being cerebral and in our heads with these deep thoughts, but how we are enfleshing this gospel, enfleshing this truth.
Yeah.
We want the church to wake up. And for those that go through that undoneness, whether by choice or thrust into it by trauma, by life experience and altering, they're almost compelled into that, trying to see the gospel become flesh in their life. And they need community around them to help them do that. But there's also, as Job, or Jacob, as you said, there's those that wrestle. I know for myself, I took it on. I'm that guy. I will wrestle with God at the side of the river. Yeah, I know he's God, but I'll still wrestle. I'm ready.
Yeah.
And it builds, that Ezekiel 18, the valley of dry bones, it builds those sinews and that flesh and that flourishing sense of embodiment of reconstruction. That's just kind of walking through the process in my head.
Yeah.
But
no, I think that's so important to articulate. If our belief and action don't line up, what is the value of our belief? It's meaningless.
Yeah. I'm praying our church hears those words. Talking about putting flesh on the bones, some fancy words, ecclesial formation. I think that's something that we can look at. In missional circles, we talk about starting with Christology, moving into missiology, and the last is into the ecclesiology, the practices of church, of community. The things that we do that build connection between ourselves as a community, ourselves in our rooted lands, and ourselves with God. How do church systems create spiritual homelessness, maybe, while claiming spiritual hospitality, perhaps particularly with terms like special needs ministries or handicapped seating?
Yeah, okay. I'm going to get your help to answer this question, I think, but I'll give it a go and then you should add to it.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah, I think those examples you just said, those are the gap between what churches claim they offer and what's really happening. And it's just picking up on such a specific aspect of who people are. So imagine, I was trying to think of corollaries to this. Imagine if we had signs in church that said okay, this pew is just for people who are colorblind, or this is for people who are left-handed. This Sunday is National Diabetes Awareness Week. I just think it's strange the things we choose to focus on. I read a book once where the argument was that we are all temporarily able. So if we live long enough, we will all experience what it's like to be disabled if we're lucky enough. So these days, these Sundays that purport to raise awareness, I think they're just stigmatizing one group within the membership. But you should chime in here.
I think you're doing wonderful, but I think one of the things I often hear about is the referral system. You should go to that church down the street that has this wonderful community of disabled people. Instead of recognizing that when a church is placed in a neighborhood, the actual practice of rootedness is to see who your neighbors are.
Right.
So not program, not platform, not performance, but presence. The church leadership and the church community needs to learn and see where they are present and how their presence brings Jesus and the gospel to that neighborhood, including the 1 in 4 neighbors who are disabled.
Yeah.
Instead of just referring down to the next block.
Yeah. Can I add one thing there? There's so many of the triggers that cause deconstruction. this is not in the book, but I've started talking about them more in my presentation since the book came out. Like, they all require similar postures as a response from the church. So the starting point, and it's the same response is, I think, called for with what you were just describing: repentance, awareness, education, and then ultimately restoration. Like, you can follow those same steps for almost any of the traumas or the internal debates that are happening for people causing their deconstruction.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think also reframing accessibility with the understanding of church culture as opposed to church structure. We often, I see churches, they make the building wonderfully accessible,
Right.
but the visibility of disabled presence is not there or seen. In fact, sometimes I've seen how the accessibilizing of churches make the disabled even more invisible. As I was sharing with a friend before, we make all the accessible seats at the very front row of the congregation with a stage that is literally 2 feet over top of their heads.
Yeah.
And they're never seen, right? You don't see the disabled.
Yeah.
And so I think we need to make it accessible. Not only that, but make every activity of the church accessible.
Yeah.
We say Sunday mornings are absolutely accessible, but
Yeah.
men's retreats, women's retreats, community activities, oh, I'm sorry, they're not quite accessible, available. We'll see you on Sunday.
Yeah.
That's not a good culture of accessibility.
Yeah.
Yeah. After hearing many of the stories of the undone in your book, what is the difference between inclusion and belonging for you?
Yeah, I had to think about that one for a while. As I understand it, I think inclusion gets at the policies and the procedures. So what's being done or what's being advertised as being done. But belonging is deeper, and it's that human level in terms of what it actually feels like. So the real, like, working out of that. So you asked about the stories of the undone. I think for the undone, it's kind of a mix of both of those experiences. We definitely talked with people who questioned their faith, or they called out leaders for different reasons, and then they got shunned, or they were made to feel like they were the problem because they pointed something out. So they were excluded, sometimes unintentionally, sometimes very deliberately. And the deliberate examples would be changing changing the form of subscription or the membership list, or making it something, there's votes, there's nominations for who's on council. So those could be the deliberate ways, but sometimes it's not that explicit. It could just, you feel more subtly unwelcome. You're not invited to things, or like you described, you can't get to the men's retreat. And all of that can affect your sense of belonging. So I thought of one example that relates to mental health. If you would agree that people with mental illnesses face some of the same stigmas and prejudice that the disabled community does. Can I make that assumption? So a family member of mine was in the hospital because of mental health challenges. And I was describing the diagnosis and this effect to a friend who was a pastor. And that person said about my family member, but he seemed like such a nice person. And that was deeply painful for me to hear, because nothing about mental illness really has to do with niceness, right? That statement was discriminatory, and it made it seem like the mental health crisis was this person's fault. Like they had chosen it, or maybe they just hadn't done a very good job of covering it up. Or now that I think about it, maybe the real crime was like that they were tricked. He seemed nice, but actually has a mental illness. Why didn't I know that? But you would never say, imagine, I can't believe she broke her leg. She seemed like such a nice person. Like, we just don't make those statements about other things. So that's the lack of belonging when those kinds of statements are made.
I just shared this morning on my social platform, don't judge a disability by its visibility. And I think it's important to recognize that not all disabilities are necessarily visible to the eye.
Yeah.
And it's also important to articulate that disability, whether seen or unseen, is not a loss of human identity
Yeah,
or dignity
absolutely.
or a negative form on that person's identity. Very important to say.
All are made in the image of God.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, all are made in the image of God. And our building with them is one that entwines us with one another in
Yeah.
equity,
Yeah.
not difference. So, trying to build on this ecclesiology, I was thinking in chapter 19 of your book, Loving Jesus and Not the Bride, you do something that I really like as a missional guy.
Mm.
You try to build it on the model of Jesus.
Mm.
And I'm wondering if you might want to maybe take us deeper into those thought lines. What might it look like for Jesus to be the model of ecclesiology in our church, as opposed to institutional formats today?
Yeah, I love that you brought that up. It's almost like you could say Jesus is the shepherd of the deconstructing folks, because it was really interesting how everyone we interviewed, again and again, they had given up on church, but not on Jesus. He still inspired and was respected and mattered, even to people that had left the church a long time ago and wouldn't even call themselves a Christian anymore necessarily. One of the people we interviewed said, "The only reason I continue to engage with the church is because of the teachings of Jesus." I think a lot of people connect with his heart for justice, especially, and that's where they might begin to reconstruct their faith if they do. And here, maybe the difference potentially is it's no longer about a personal relationship necessarily with Jesus. It might be, but it's more often taking inspiration from things like his humility and the way that he didn't seek power. You were talking earlier about the power and the platform and the privilege. He's the opposite, right? He doesn't focus on those things. We throw the phrase around servant leader. I don't know too many actual servant leaders except for Jesus, right? Like, we're not very good at that in the way that he was. But to my mind, Jesus always focused at the level of the individual. He showed us, like, he modeled that for us, going after the one instead of the 99. And so that, to me, really fits beautifully with the story of the undone.
Can I push back on that a little bit? I was thinking that one of the beauties of Jesus is that he focuses both in the temple and outside the temple. So he does both communal and individual relationship building. When from a very young age, when he disappeared from his parents and his parents were out looking for him, they find him in the temple teaching the Pharisees. He says, "Did you not know I'd be about my Father's work?" Whenever Jesus entered the temple or the synagogues, the community worship centers, it was never Jesus who left. It was the people that pushed him out. And so I think when I think of how Jesus draws a practice of church and community building, he doesn't distinguish what's in or out of the four walls of the church, if you will. He engages both. But I will say, as a disabled person myself, trying to advocate for my community and for people who are disabled, I don't know how he does that, because you're right. I can't model that well. I can get frustrated, especially when I get confined into those four walls and feeling the resistance of them. I don't know how he did it with such love in his heart. I'll just say that.
No, thank you.
Yeah,
You made my answer better. That's really well said. Yeah, you're right.
I
It's
don't know.
both. Yeah. Hmm.
Maybe we'll talk a bit about advocacy and justice, that kind of prophetic work. I know you spoke of this before, but as both an editor and social justice advocate, how do you hold contemplation and activism together without collapsing one into the other? Because it's easy to get lost in one over the other.
Yeah, I think contemplation, the value there for us is really that it's a corrective to our culture's obsession with productivity, right? And growth and accomplishments. So if we're able to be contemplative, then we can remind ourselves God's love doesn't hinge on anything we do or don't do. As we said earlier, we are all worthy, image bearers of God. The end. So we can't win or lose that worthiness based on what we do or what our bodies do or can't do. The world, it doesn't matter. It doesn't hinge on us. It doesn't run because of us. I'm taking a course right now through the Institute for Christian Studies on the contemplative practice, so I have to give them credit for this. I just read this recently, a short piece called Sabbath by Abraham Joshua Heschel, and he says, the higher goal of spiritual living is not to amass a wealth of information, but to face sacred moments. So amazingly, he said that in 1951. And talk about amassing a wealth of information now, right? That's what most of us spend our lives doing. If not information, things, right? And he talks about we're focused on things, but the Sabbath and God's invitation to be contemplative is to focus on time and to make that holy instead of things in space. So I think that kind of right sizes us. We follow this urge to put ourselves at the center of everything. I think contemplation can take that and kind of just be that corrective. But then activism has a role too, because if you follow the news, if you are a compassionate, listening person, then you have some awareness of problems in the world. And it's important to try to address those and solve them. So I think we need both these sides of our personality. God gives us kind of this 6-to-1 ratio in terms of the days of the week. But like holy agitation, waving some signs, some protest energy, like those are all important things too. In between sacred, quiet moments. It's a tricky balancing act. I don't think I have it perfectly, but I can see the value in both for sure.
Yeah, I think it would be important too to frame that activism in a expression of love too. It's easy for, I won't name any names, but for churches to create protest signs and join the cause of their particular bias.
Yeah.
But we need to keep that servant heart forward first.
Yeah.
And that contemplative Jesus is the direction and the embodiment of this, not my church, not my theology or my institution. That in mind, something I've been really questioning, and I know I spoke with Joash about a few weeks ago. How does disabled spiritual formation shape public resistance? And in conjunction with that, who is responsible for fostering a disabled spiritual formation?
These are such good questions. And how does it challenge? What did you say? How does it shape public resistance? Is that what you asked?
Yeah. How does it shape and form kind of public resistance and our practices of it?
Yeah, well, if you think about the fact that you're questioning, these conversations are kind of questioning the current systems of power, which you could just say are the status quo, right? So in the church, maybe what are the systems of power? Well, who's in the pulpit? What theology is? Maybe sometimes the space, like you talked about the architecture. But what if churches were not lagging behind? Let's talk about the space here. Sometimes, is it true that churches are kind of grandfathered in with accessibility codes because it's too hard to change like an older building?
I think some are, but I also think that can be, I mean, this is just personal bias, but I think churches use that as an excuse.
Right.
To avoid, the call for change that the Spirit puts upon them.
Right. Yeah, I think so too. Or they say it's too expensive, right? But I think those changes actually aren't that difficult. It just requires the same things like repentance, awareness, education, and listening to the voices of the people that it affects. So those are the prophetic critiques of the systems. You asked about disabled spiritual formation. I think that's the responsibility of the church and the church leaders. It would just be the same as any kind of faith formation. And the same pastoral care would be needed, right? Not just physical needs, but emotional, spiritual, everything. The same invitations to grow in faith, the same invitations to join leadership. I think all of that would be a kind of public resistance.
Yeah. I want to add a bit to that. I think it's important for the leadership of the church and the community to not only teach about disabled spirituality, but to learn as well, to grow, and not defer it off to, oh, well, that's only for the disabled people.
Yeah.
There's a recognition that the disabled presence in our community is one that brings wholeness and the fullness of our community. To segregate it off doesn't allow for it to have the power that it's given by the Spirit to speak to what it means to be in relationship with God and with the land around us. And in conjunction, I know we could say that this has to be done in partnership. Some might resist saying, well, let's just let the disabled people teach disabled spirituality. This is not a healthy or proper framework. It's important for us to learn and grow together. That's that equity part, so that we both learn and teach at the same time in partnership. So leadership of the church is responsible, but also the empowerment of disabled leadership to come alongside other leadership and disciple the community. I think that's important. Yeah. I know it was a few weeks ago, I think my friend Mike Hogtert and you and others were part of the Nate's gathering that took place recently. So I know also a little over a year ago when we were talking, you gave me some great thoughts into how the reconciliation process with the Indigenous people of Canada kind of speaks into the disabled finding reconciliation with church and community. So I want to look at that a little bit deeper too, and start by asking, where do you see parallels between disabled advocacy and the First Nations reconciliation movement in Canada? I know you might just have a few brief thoughts there, maybe.
Yeah, I was not at that Nate's event. I know Mike was, I'm sure. This is ringing a slight bell to our conversation last year, but I didn't realize this part of the conversation came out of that conversation. Okay.
Well, let's explore it a bit.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, like I wonder, was I thinking about just the way that it can be kind of tokenized, and like the land acknowledgement, it can be meaningful, but it can also just be checking a box and then moving on, and there's no real engagement or relationship.
Yeah.
Are those some of the parallels?
I think those were some of the parallels you mentioned, but also you talked a bit about the power of storytelling. And I know you talk about this in your book too. Particularly, I know there was a chapter that seemed to talk about, I use couch and pew, which I seemed to focus on the psychology aspects of Undone. But I think it was in that chapter you talked about the power of storytelling. And how that is being done with the reconciliation process here in Canada with the Indigenous. And I'm wondering how it might parallel or find another expression or form for the disabled. How can the disabled tell their story more?
Oh, that's so interesting. Well, with reconciliation, of course, there was this government mandate, right, to research the truth and reconciliation. So they listened to thousands of stories over many years and then took the information and made these calls to action. So that's a very specific set of steps that I think is helpful for anybody. And it's been something concrete that churches can try to follow. And I think of the 11 that apply to churches, half have been done. So it's not perfect, but it's something to work with. You mentioned relationship near the beginning of our conversation. And that reminds me of Jody Sparger's book, Mend, one of New Leaf's more recent books. Have you had a chance to read that one yet?
I know of it. I haven't read it yet.
She tells this beautiful story of a church she pastored in downtown Vancouver where there were a lot of First Nations families attending the church, mostly kids. And then she was teaching Sunday school and she started noticing that kids were disappearing. So they would come for a little while and then they'd be gone, and in quite high numbers. And so she would ask other kids, where's so-and-so? And they would say, oh, he's in foster. And so many of these Indigenous kids were being moved around a lot, and they weren't with their families, and they weren't staying long enough to, be a regular member of the Sunday school. So her church made this deliberate decision to come alongside some of these Indigenous families and help them in the social work in different stages, go to court, answer the phone call when a social worker called, and help the families in the ways they needed to, just to become more stable places so that their own kids were not taken away and put into foster care. So she tells the story of one First Nations woman who hadn't set foot in church her whole life because of grandparents who had been in residential school. But she came to church in order to say thank you for helping our family keep our kids, essentially. And so to me, this illustrates like the core of what is needed, which is really a relationship. It's the day-to-day, it's the life, it's the phone call in the middle of the night, and the very practical, small, concrete ways that we can help each other.
I want to ask you in this part too. You have this part on Jesus therapy in Couch and Pew, and you write, "We believe that in Jesus all things hold together," which means he can be found in therapy too. Although it's a stretch in this context, one of the titles subscribed to him is Wonderful Counselor. As seen in the conversations with Nicodemus, the woman at the well, and the paralyzed man at the pool. Of course, that caught my eye, right?
Yeah.
Throughout my life and after my spinal cord injury with becoming disabled in a wheelchair, therapy and psychology has been a deep part of my life. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about what you're saying here.
Yeah, well, this chapter was included because every single person we interviewed mentioned therapy and the need for it in processing what had happened to them. So that's significant, right? Somebody said, therapy saved me. It seemed to be part of the trail that everybody took in one way or another. And so initially, we called this chapter, which right now it's Couch and Pew. Initially, we called it Couch or Pew. But then we realized that was unhelpful in setting up this false dichotomy, even though it did sort of sometimes feel like people are leaving the church for the counselor's office. But it really doesn't. That similar to what we're saying at the very beginning about undone isn't the end of the story. That's unhelpful. We don't need that dichotomy. We don't need to choose between religion and psychology. They can work together, right, for the whole health of a person, spiritual and mental. So I think that Christ can be found in the services of a trained psychiatrist. Whether or not that person uses religious language, it doesn't matter, through their care or their compassion or the search for healing. So if you think of Jesus and the woman at the well, Jesus just began by listening. I think listening can be its own ministry. And that's really all we're getting at with that chapter.
Yeah. And seeking therapy. Actually, one of the thoughts I had was maybe that's one of the ways the church can act with advocacy and activism is making therapy more accessible, affordable, and available for disabled people and the rest of the community, recognizing the significant importance it has in a person's undoneness and the way they reconstruct and the journey they walk forward with Jesus.
Yeah, you're right. Part of the case for churches to respond better to allegations of abuse is to provide automatic funding for victims of abuse so that they can seek therapy, because it is expensive.
Abuse or trauma. Or I should say abuse and trauma.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that is significant discussion amongst those, particularly with disabled people, and I think of the work of my friend Heather Morgan, is embodiment, and how embodiment impacts our identity and our understanding of belonging. How does undoneness confront the myth of the normal body and the ideal Christian?
I guess the simplest answer is just because being undone is the opposite of shiny. It's gritty. It's faith that's really been through the ringer. It does not look good anymore. So normal and ideal, like, we make all these assumptions around those words, and they're mostly based on marketing. They're not accurate to the wide range of human experience and embodiment. So if we can begin there and we are honest about that, it takes the pressure off everybody. It should actually be a big relief that there is no, I would argue, there is no ideal Christian or perfect faith.
Yeah. Nor embodiment of the gospel and the ways that it finds expression. I think Jesus coming back from the cross with scars in his hands and feet, a wound in his side that he tells Thomas to put his hands in. That's a pretty dirty, grimy picture to envision. And yet this is the expression of what the gospel comes in. This is the embodiment of it.
Yeah.
And the church needs to see this more. I love the way that I came up with these words. So I got to ask this question. Is disability exposing a deeper theological truth that interdependence is not a defect, but a design feature of humanity?
Yeah, I think so. I do. Like, I think you're onto something here. You could write a thesis on it, probably. And I have to defer a little bit to Amy Kenny here in her book, My Body's Not a Prayer Request, because she has this beautiful part where she describes in the New Jerusalem, Zechariah describes elderly men and women with canes, and they're playing with young people in the streets. So Kenny interprets this as God incorporating folks into the beloved community by meeting their access needs, because Jeremiah says God will lead them down a level path. So she says this future welcomes us just as we are, not attempting to fix us before we're admitted into the kingdom. The goodness between us can be restored. And so learning this deeper theological truth is that it's just simply the second commandment: love your neighbor as yourself, and just do it a little bit better, I think. That's that interdependency part.
Yeah, I think most seminaries and colleges teach that God created us as relational creatures. We were meant to be in relationship.
Yeah.
So independence is a myth, people. Let's realize interdependence is the very nature we were designed in. One thing I got to mention about canes, my Aunt Ruth taught me very young that canes have multiple purposes. Not only can they help you walk and find stability, but they make great hockey sticks too.
That's so Canadian. I love it.
So, one of the things we talk about in The Well is, of course, hope and how we experience hope. I like to say that hope is not an optimism. Hope is not denial. Hope is not positivity. Hope is the courage to remain human in inhuman systems. Some of the thought lines that I sometimes use to frame that understanding of hope. But I'd like to ask you, what kind of hope does undoneness create for the disabled person? And what kind of hope does it maybe destroy?
Okay, I will do my best to answer this, and then I would love to hear your answer, because this is another one of these really good questions. Like, seriously, Eric, these are amazing questions. Yeah, I had to think about this one for a minute, too. The hope it might create, this idea of undoneness, and I sincerely believe that there are more people on the margins or in the wilderness than it might seem at first. And I think that is so true. Many, many people are carrying around wounds of some kind. often inflicted by fellow Christians. The disabled community could be the experts here in bringing some of those disparate people together. But when I was thinking about your question and what hope might this idea of undone destroy, I thought, okay, well, actually on the cover, this guy carrying his canoe, that's kind of an ableist metaphor, maybe, even canoe camping, that idea. And I'm sorry about that. And even as a metaphor, portaging is hard work, whether you're disabled or not. And in the book, what that is equated to is just the work of finding a new church community. That's kind of the ending solution. That's really hard. It doesn't happen quickly or easily, and it might not always be possible. So I have to think about the effectiveness of that as a solution.
Okay. The thought that came to my mind, I'm just finishing Richard Beck's book, The Shape of Joy. And he's talking a bit toward the end about transcendent hope and transcendent joy. And he uses this imagery, which is what's the word? The image can be one of two things. I can't think of the term. Anyways, you can either see it as a duck or you can see it as a rabbit.
Okay.
And so if you see it as a duck, it's a negative. It's, all hope is lost. There's nothing here for life, nothing for meaning. Or you see it as a rabbit, and it becomes something that catapults you into newness of thought, into reconstruction of a life that is full of joy and experience. But I was sort of thinking about that when you were describing the canoe and carrying the canoe. Can it be an ableist image? It could be. But what if we reframe that as someone who's carrying a cross? A cross can be a duck or it can be a rabbit. Something that transcends and takes you into the newness of a life that is full of God's glory, presence, love, compassion, joy. This is something that I guess I've learned through my undoneness. So when I think from the disabled framework, what does it create? It creates most definitely some challenges, some wrestling, but it also creates a life that shapes an amazing world before me filled with wonder, of a gift to be able to have creative powers of puzzle solving, of seeing things deeper than, well, you'll probably laugh at this, but deeper than a lot of other people see it.
For sure.
And experiencing the gospel in a much more enfleshed way, an embodied way, than maybe the average person might, if you will. The person that has not experienced the traumas that I have. Trauma has become a strength builder in me and not just a diminishment. And I think, what does it destroy? It destroys, in some sense, you can say it destroyed my sense of invincibility. But this was a good thing. This was a good thing to recognize I'm a finite being. It destroyed my sense of independence, which is also a good thing because I recognize the strength and power of interdependence. It destroyed my sense of seeking perfection, knowing that in the imperfect is where I find Jesus, is where I find God, where I find the life that doesn't put the demands on me that perfectionism does.
Yeah.
So that's where hope, I think, becomes the rabbit that takes me down the trail, down new holes of adventure and life. So we started this conversation about adventure. I think it's great that we draw into that a little bit. Before I get into an adventurous question, though, I do want to ask you, because you hinted at it earlier. It's been a few years now since Blessed or the Undone has been out. And I'd like to ask you, is there anything that you might have done differently in the book? And has anything changed since you first put those thoughts on paper or hit those keys on the keypad?
Yeah, before I answer that, I just want to say thank you for your answer to that last question. That was really beautiful. And I love what you said. It reminded me of there's a acronym like PTSD, but it has to do with resilience. And I can't think of the letters, but it's something like post-traumatic resilience or growth, which sounds a little bit like what you're describing. Yeah, that resonates with me. Has anything changed or would I do it differently? When I reread the book now, I think, oh man, yeah, we could have explained this a little bit better or made this flow more, but it was really an ambitious topic from the start. It kind of has these tangents in lots of directions that different people have picked up on, different sections. I think for the most part, we pulled it together okay. Has anything changed since the book came out? I mean, yes, I am a member of the Christian Reformed denomination, and we're at the tail end of this, years-long debate about whether or not it's sinful to be gay or to act on that. That has frankly split the church since we started. Peter and I remember when we first began research in 2021, we were a little bit worried that just the idea of deconstruction would be passé by the time the book came out. But actually, it's just as relevant as ever. We have people in their 20s, people in their 70s. They have said things like, I felt like I was reading my life story. Something still resonates, maybe because of those church splits and schisms. I don't know. We wrote a whole chapter on Trump before the 2024 election. So unfortunately, that chapter is just as relevant as ever. I wish it was not. And the other thing that's kind of changed is there's this new fear actually of the word deconstruction. So rather than becoming passé, it's almost grown in power, but in a negative way, which I did not expect. And I think that's because, again, of this fear and the culture war language. But I think it just shows that the debate around what is deconstruction, that's not over yet. And the role it has in the future of the church isn't over yet either. So, yeah, we'll see.
Well, as we shared earlier, deconstruction is inevitable for any organization, church, community, or person. It's how we're willing to navigate that with one another and in our own footsteps forward. So I hope that the words you shared today are heard by the many leaders out there, to not be afraid of deconstruction, not to be fearful of culture change and the change of your faith, the change of spirituality. Let's be honest. The Christian church, the Jewish community, nation, the history of human spirituality has never, ever not gone without change in history. Yeah. This is not the same Christian church today that we were in 2,000 years ago.
Yeah.
So let's not try and be that church still.
Yeah,
let's see
true.
let's see where the Spirit's going. Let's go into that adventure. What is an adventure you have always wanted to take but have not yet gone on?
Oh, I would love to hike the cliffs in Ireland. I just think it's so beautiful. And I love their accents. It would be a delight to be there.
I know my pastor, James Payton, would be very pleased to hear that. That's great. Yes, beautiful scenes there. I've seen lots of pictures. I'll say growing up, this isn't a very Christian movie, people, but Highlander was one of my favorite cult classic movies when I was young. And part of my love for them and passion was the scenery, the beautiful scenery. So that would be a great adventure. I will ask. Did you have any questions for me?
What do you think is the biggest takeaway from Blessed Are the Undone in relation to the disabled community that maybe churches could learn from?
I think one of the biggest things that I hope my listeners and the disabled community can hear and understand is we need to expand our imaginations around your writing in Blessed is the Undone as being metaphorical and hearing the story of the disabled community in that undoneness. There is, My library is growing, and I didn't start in the stream of disabled theology. I started in missional theology, community development, pastoral works, But what I learned to do and found was to see how all of that language and all of that learning and spiritual work metaphorically spoke into my life as a disabled person. And I hope that my listeners and that the disabled community can do the same. We read Blessed is the Undone as not specifically speaking into the disabled world, but seeing the mirror parallels and the metaphorical connection points, the entwining of that story in our own stories. Also, one of the big things I've taken away from our conversation is the need for the disabled story to grow. I was listening to your audiobook as well, and I was taking a 5-kilometer wheel down by my parents' place in Fish Creek. And I was thinking to myself, man, there isn't a lot of disabled expressions of story out there. And we need more disabled people to tell their stories on print. We need disabled theology books. We need Blessed Are the Disabled put out there, the Amy Kennys and others. But we need more of that to be seen and shared so that the church can see how they also are metaphorically connected and entwined with our story as a whole community.
Amen.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, how might our listeners learn more about what you are writing, what you are doing today, and be able to connect with you further?
Yeah, you can check out my website, which is angelareitsmabick.ca, for podcast links and connection to Substack. I'm also doing a little bit of teaching, so I have an online course through the Institute for Christian Studies in Toronto, and there's one I taught last year that I'm going to teach again this winter, and it's on Canadian literature with themes of faith and doubt. And so this is open to anybody. It's not just graduate students, it's lifelong learners. So we had people from all over North America. Last winter, we read through some key Canadian novels and then used those narratives to kind of come at these same issues from a new angle. And it was really a lot of fun. And I'm currently building a second course along the same lines, but focused on music. So Canadian singer-songwriters who wrestle with their faith in their music.
Wow. Awesome. That's great. Well, Angela, thank you so much for joining with me today. This has been a great blessing. I'm so thankful you were willing to be with me at the bottom of the well and in the Well Dwellers podcast, and deeply thankful for your friendship.
It was absolutely my pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me, and it was so good to talk with you.